and welcome to another episode of the Simply Connected podcast, your go-to spot for discovering new connections. On this week's episode, I sit down with Steph, and I feel like I could have talked to Steph for hours, but we jumped into a whole bunch of fun conversations all around goal setting and what those goals can look like when you're living your life in alignment. We talked about micro connections in our everyday life. We talked about technology and what connection looks like through technology, whether there's hindrances or pros to it. And then we also did a really fun visualization that I can't wait for you to check out. Enjoy. All right. Hey, Stefanie.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for joining me for an episode of the Simply Connected podcast.
Of course.
I'm thrilled to have you here today, and I feel like I always start off every episode this way, but it's a little bit of an icebreaker, and it kind of gets that conversation flowing. But it's the dreaded question that people hate to answer.
Okay.
I'm just going to throw it your way, and I'm going to ask you to tell our listeners about yourself.
All right. I think commonly people will start with like career. I am not. I'm going to start with that I'm a mom. And that I think that I attempt to walk through the world with a sense of like creativity. And I happen to also be a social worker and psychotherapist. Yeah.
I love it.
Okay.
I love it. So let's start off with what you started off with. You're a mom.
I am.
How many kids?
I have two.
Two, okay.
And fairly big age difference, so about 5.75 years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I love it. And how has been navigating motherhood with an age difference, but as a mother?
I love the age difference. I think that they have had this, and they've articulated this to me, this beautiful opportunity to both be like single children, and then also have this like beautiful little relationship together. It does get into that, I think, sibling rivalry situation every so often, but more often than not, they're just like really cool, like best friends.
I love it.
Yeah.
And how would you describe them? What are their personalities like?
Oh my goodness, completely different.
Okay.
So the older one, I would say logical, really likes a good linear thought pattern, and at the same time can like explain constellations like you've never seen. I remember one time we were on the docks in the summertime, and the comets were coming like over, and I just thought it was a beautiful moment, like, look at the pretty comets. And he was like, did you know that NASA found like XYZ? And just went into this like long narrative. So that is one of them.
Wow.
I know. And the other one, I think that they're like an 800-year-old soul.
Okay, an old soul.
Old soul, unbelievably creative. Such a beautiful sense of compassion. And together, you know, I say that like I pay for my little roommates, but like they are cool humans.
Yeah. Eh?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, good to hear. Do they remind you of you at all when you were a kid or growing up?
I think the younger one around like the creativity, but they both live in a world that values authenticity, I think, more than when I grew up. It was a little bit more kind of linear. Mm-hmm. They're just living their best lives.
Good for them.
Yeah.
Good for them.
Yeah.
And so what were you like as a kid?
My perspective or other people's? I would say that I was a kid that walked through the world a little bit in a daydream, and also realizing that the world did not always love a good daydreamer. I think now as an adult, I value that curiosity and value kind of like that larger kind of thought process, and more thinking in constellations than in this like really linear way. However, then I don't know if I understood that not everyone sees the world that way. Mm-hmm. But yeah, highly creative and really just loved a good daydream.
Yeah. That piques my interest because I feel like that resonates with me. Why would you describe yourself as a daydreamer? Like what was it about that you're like, yeah, that's how I would describe myself?
I think in two ways. Like one, just an imagination, right? Like liking the act of a wandering mind, right? Because sometimes we're just like so focused on the doing, the producing, whatever it happens to be. We don't always let our minds just like float around. And I think the other way is, I didn't learn this until I was an adult, but my brain will naturally think of things as like a mind map, they call it now, but I always like referred to it as like a constellation. So when when I'm talking with someone, I'm like clocking these things and joining them to like other ideas, whether I've had or whether they've shared with me. And so when I then meet someone, they're a constellation and I'm putting that together. And I didn't know that not everyone does that.
Okay.
Until which I think comes to that piece that you're really focused on around connection, is that I didn't know that other people didn't do that.
Okay.
And so when you don't know, you're attempting to connect in this way where I'm like, doesn't everyone see the world like in this constellation, slightly abstract, but like still in putting things together?
No, eh?
Yeah, not everyone does it.
And so would you say you carried kind of that with you throughout maybe adolescence, high school, and into your 20s and whatnot? Like that same feeling?
I think it was kind of being in two worlds, right? Of wanting to achieve the goals that I wanted to set for myself. So like when I was in high school, let's say, like going to university, and knowing that was a very like linear path. Like you needed to do X, Y, Z. And there wasn't always a lot of room in there for daydreaming or like going outside of the norm, right? And then as I got older, I realized like, no, like finding my authenticity and recognizing this is who I am as a unique human being on this world was more valuable. But I think when you're younger, you don't necessarily have the power that sometimes allows you to like really move into like alignment or authenticity.
Okay. And so knowing that, what made you touched on your career and what you do for work, was that always kind of the goal, or what made you come to kind of that conclusion?
100% no. Started in journalism. Then thought I may have wanted to be a teacher. I respect all teachers so much.
We love teachers.
We love teachers. I was not meant to be one. I actually went back to school what people would consider like fairly late in life. Then I made a career switch in my late 20s.
Okay.
And then moved into social work and psychotherapy. Around that time.
So what was it growing up that made you first attracted to a career in journalism?
I loved writing. I didn't know it was as diverse as it is as a discipline. I think I went in with that kind of value set or that curiosity around writing someone's kind of story or what that might look like. I think that's a small subset of like what journalism actually is. And I think what drew me to kind of like more psychology, social work, psychotherapy was like actually becoming in touch with like who I am and what doesn't feel pushed.
Okay. Forced
or like that, just like that lack of alignment. And it's a really interesting journey that I would say that I've done more that was aligned and within people's like, I think, framing of quote unquote like success in the past 12 years than I did the previous 12. And that felt like really pushed.
Okay. And before we hop into your career and what you do, because I think it's so fascinating, do you still carry that passion for kind of writing? Maybe not journalism, but writing, journaling, I guess thought dumping like that. Do you still carry that with you now and into your work now?
Love the term thought dumping. Sorry, let's pause. Yes. So I made this, I think during the pandemic, everybody had these moments. Most people had these moments of like enlightenment of like, where do I go? And one of mine was, how would I just start writing poetry again? Because I hadn't written poetry for, I'm going to say 12 years. That's going to be our number right now. Okay. But definitely probably more. And so I did. And then I just submitted it. And one of them did get published. But my whole thing is like just submitting things.
Yeah.
And I'm okay being rejected because it's so aligned with what I want to do and what feels good and what feels like really what I call like delicious. I don't care. It will find its place somewhere.
That's amazing. Mm-hmm. And I feel like poetry is just such a broad word. Do you have, I guess not necessarily a style, but is there a type of poetry that you like to write, or is it kind of just what comes to you in the moment?
I would say what comes to me in the moment. I do love E.E. Cummings' work. I don't know if people can Google that. Yeah. His like early works, as a backstory, pretty like traditional, I would say, like poetry. And then as I think his authenticity grows, or like this is what I interpret, his poems became like quite playful. And even on the page, the way that the words were written, they would be like on the other side of the page, right? For example. And I always felt like really drawn to that. How like you can write something in like this linear way, and sure, it's going to resonate with some people, or you could just like go off script.
Yeah.
And I really feel like more and more I've been like leaning in to that piece of me just to see how it feels. Because sometimes it's just like wild, and you're like, oh, that really fit. And other times you're like, ooh, that was wild in the not good way.
And then in the not good way. I don't write poetry. I mean, I say that, but I mean, maybe I do, because it could be left to interpretation.
Very much so.
But I was a very big writer and reader as a kid, constantly journaling, short stories, thought dumping, just like getting everything on paper. Like I have notebooks filled with stories and daydreams and what I wanted my life to look like and things like that. And I recently have turned to reading more poetry or spoken word. And I feel like there's an author in Ottawa who published her first book that leaned more into grief and grace and things like that. And her poems just like really spoke to me. And then there's another like a bigger artist who wrote her first book of poetry, and it kind of was a timeline of a moment or a snapshot in her life of all the things she went through.
Yeah.
And I find that it's a beautiful way to resonate or kind of change your thought pattern in comparison to a novel or a story, right? I feel like with poetry, the thoughts are more vulnerable in a way, and they can sit with you kind of how you want them to sit. So I feel like that is just a great tool almost in learning about yourself and kind of, I don't know, rediscovering little things that you didn't know, and also just like helping to heal. Like,
I could not agree more. Right. I really loved what you said around like novels versus poetry, because a novel, often a book in general, like takes energy and dedication, right, to be able to sit there and like have time to do it. Whereas I find like a poem you can read and reread again, like gather different points from it, and almost like let it play in your mind throughout the day. And I think that's like the gift of poetry.
Absolutely. I always thought I was going to write the next great story, great novel, and who knows, I could still do it one day.
Like, don't rule that out.
No, but I find with poetry, it's almost more like a short story, right? So I don't know. I feel like where I am in my journey with writing and using that as such a big outlet in my life, a book of short stories is like
yes,
right? Yeah.
Well, and people can like really take so much away from that too, right? Like that snippet. Short stories, I started reading them after I had my first child, because I just had no brain power to read like a novel, but you're up at like all hours of the night, like feeding a child, right? And then like rocking. And so I really got into short stories because they were manageable, but also like really enjoyable.
Yeah. And I feel like you get to the plot a lot quicker too.
100%. And as a writer,
you need to, yeah, you're like, I'm there.
Yeah.
Okay. So sliding into, I guess, your career now and where you're focused. On this show, we like to touch on all things connection.
Yeah.
And what that looks like, whether it's connection to people, connection to self, connection to projects, music, anything. There's connection is a whole world of its own, right? So I've asked this question, I think, to almost everyone, but I get a similar but different answer each time, which I think is really interesting, because connection is both a personal and a non-personal thing, right? Like you build connections, like I just said, in the world, but also with yourself. So before we dive into more of the work side of your life, what does connection look like, or what does it mean to you?
Oh, the big one. Okay. I think the first thing that comes to mind would be something that Brene Brown said around finding a sense of belonging. So when I hear the word connection, like the second word that comes to mind is belonging. And what she said, and I'm going to quote this incorrectly, but here we go, that belonging is when you can kind of live in your authenticity versus having to like fit in. And I think to me, like that's at the core of connection, is that like when you're in that space of like true connection with someone and not just meeting them or speaking to them or having a moment with them, then you're able to be your fully authentic self. Now, the tricky bit with that is that you actually have to know yourself to know when you're trying to fit in or when you're actually kind of moving with that authenticity and you feel that connection. And I think that's where we get stuck a lot, because there are a lot of distractions in this world. There's a lot of ways in which we've been told we should work or we should do things. And we are not often told to like cultivate a sense of authenticity, but it can bring such deep connection as soon as we're able to know when we feel like we belong in that space.
Yeah, and I love that you reference Brene Brown, because my therapist in my early sessions with her brought up Brene Brown and talked about some books, and I bought the books and read the books, so I know what it is you're talking about, and I can totally and wholeheartedly just agree with that, right? And you feel it, because we all want to belong, but in order to belong and to show up, you have to know yourself, or you have to be trying to get to know yourself and learning your ins and outs and how you want to kind of show up in the world, not only for yourself, but for the people around you. And so with thinking about that, what made you finally decide to want to transition into the career of helping people and in psychotherapy?
I think almost without knowing, I think now I can look back and say like what happened and what I did. In the moment, it felt like a spark of inspiration. Like it felt like this makes sense. I'm not quite sure why it makes sense, but this makes more sense than staying in the career path that I was in. And I think that was like that first part. And then as my career grew, now I can look back and say, actually, every day I get to be my authentic self. I get to connect with people. I get to, this might sound a little bit more sentimental, but like around understanding like how their heart and mind and soul kind of wants to travel, and like where are the stuck points, or where are the points of grief or sadness or anger that I can maybe help with. And can I be that person to be able to walk beside them as they navigate all of that? And so I get up every day happy.
That's rare.
It is rare, and it's also cultivated. Like this is what I get very passionate about this. I also share with people that it's possible, right? I think we've been told so many times, like, it's not possible. You can't, if you're in a career path, you have to stay there. And there's so many examples in which that's not true. However, it's risky in our mind of like, do I switch now? And it's not that you have to switch the next day, but like, can you just like pivot? And I think that was the best decision, was to pivot and to say, I'm going to trust something that aligns a little bit more than what I'm doing right now. And then as I moved through my career, it was always that question, can I align a little bit more? And then knowing when something fit. And that's the piece that I wish we, as just like humans, spent a little more time on, is being able to understand like what's important and what are our values and how do I align with that and how does it feel in my body, and how can I walk through this world in this really kind of like intentional way. And it requires us to be really curious about like, does this fit in the moment?
I feel like curious and honest too, right?
100%.
You probably get a wide array of people who come to see you and who you get to interact with on the regular. When these people or these new clients are coming to you to start their journeys, do you have kind of like a jumping off point with them, or how do you set them up to start their road to success?
Sometimes I know a little bit more about them. I think our first question is like, what would feeling better look like? Like if I was doing a documentary on you, what would you be doing differently? How would you be feeling inside? What does that look like? I think a lot of people who I work with, often that's where we start. Like, can you name an emotion? Do you know what it feels like in your body to feel anger and joy and awe and irritability and sadness? Like, do you know? And we're not really taught that. Like, we're not taught to really connect our whole self. We're like, this is what I'm thinking, versus like, this is what I'm thinking, and this is a thought that came up, and this is how it's like connecting to my body. And is it sending me in a direction that I want to go?
Yeah. And so when you start there and you're bringing them through these conversations, what do I want to say here? How's that reaction for them?
Fairly good. One piece I think for like therapy versus just like general human connection, is that alliance with your therapist is vital, right? And people don't always even know kind of that, what that even kind of feels like and looks like. And so before I even start with anyone in formal sessions, we do like a discovery session. Like, here's 15 minutes. I'm not charging you. We just want to see if we're each other's like humans. And sometimes I don't have the particular skills that I know that they need, that I know that somebody else is like more of an expert in. So I'm going to like refer out. And then sometimes they're like, I'm not sure if like our styles match. Sure. And I think that's a really interesting piece that I think, like the poetry and the rejection, or just not wanting my poem at that time, we'll soften that language. In the same way, it's okay if that human doesn't fit, because I know that it's so important to be able to find that connection with your therapist, that if they don't have that with me, I will help them find it. Because that's, I think, also an ethical role of a therapist, to be able to like find that person's person.
And I think too, I know when I started, again, back to my therapist, we had the discovery call, and I feel like it's similar to when you meet people, right? I feel like obviously you're going places and getting more vulnerable and doing the work with your therapist. So there's a bit of a difference there, but people tend to know when there's an energy connection. And you know it sometimes walking into a room, you can feel the shift in energy. You know it when you're having a conversation with a person. So I really value that idea and the fact that there are options like that for a discovery call, because you're investing your time and your thoughts and your energy both ways, right? You as a therapist and as the client. So you want to make sure that that relationship is cohesive and works, and there's trust and whatnot. And so once that relationship gets built and you've built that rapport with them, and you're working through things and you're having those conversations, you touched on loving to get a little deeper into values and passions and kind of what brings people alive. What would you say to someone who's coming to you and is just like, well, I don't know what I value. I don't even know where to start.
Yes. Love the deep questions here. One, I think it's really timely that we're having this conversation, because I think we're in the New Year's resolution like zone of life. And often we're like talking about goals a lot. And so people will say, I have the goal of this, or I would like to do this, or whatever it happens to be. And then I think it's important to have the conversation around how goals are really external, and that we've been somewhat like taught to have external feedback, and that to seek that, even like consciously or subconsciously, to be able to kind of reinforce whether we're on the right path. And so me asking someone like internally, like, what does your compass look like, is like a really kind of scary question at times, because like then it's almost like that void that people are like, I don't even know how to answer it. Or they'll kind of like do top level kind of pieces, right, to describe themselves like as their character, right? I'm kind, I'm compassionate. And so one of the exercises, do you want to indulge?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So I was taught this by a colleague, so I will do a shout out there. But how comfortable are you like closing your eyes?
Comfortable.
All right, cool. All right.
Okay.
So close your eyes. And right now we're just kind of getting you into being connected to like your internal self. I'd like you to bring to mind something that just like really you felt strong like energy and connection, or invigorated, and it could be literally anything. Something 5 years ago. It could be you having delicious coffee, really anything. Do you have it in your mind?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So I want you to really create a vibrant image. I want you to see if you can attach it to a feeling, but more so I want you to attach it to a body sensation that you're having right now. I want you just to like be in that moment and bathe in it and soak it in. Like, what were you feeling during that time? What were you experiencing? What made you feel a sense of aliveness, even if it's not a particular value, but like, what about that situation? And when you're ready, you can open your eyes.
Wow.
Are you willing to share what came up?
Yeah. So for me, it's funny that it went there in my mind, because when you mentioned it can be anything like a cup of coffee. And for me, like I've said this before, like I value my morning cup of coffee, but mine went to a moment in time about 5 years ago. And I was on vacation.
Okay. And
I had signed up for surfing lessons. Okay. I went to a surf camp, and I don't know why in this moment my mind just went there, but I remember I was by myself, other side of the world, signed up for this surf camp, and was like, let's just do it. And I remember the moment it brought me to, I was standing on the beach in the morning, a couple other people around me. I had my surfboard, and I think in that moment I went through every possible emotion I could have felt. There was fear, there was joy, there was just like uneasy, like everything. And when I just let it all stop, it was pride.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so like that's such an interesting experience, in that for you, you felt pride, but some of the values that I heard before that would be like, it sounds like you are an active learner, that you have a curious mind, that you're willing to kind of take risks that align in some way. And so this way, it kind of sounds as if it was like a risk towards self-development.
Yeah.
Right? Or like testing your boundaries. And that was able to kind of bring you to a sense of pride. And we don't always do the front end connection, right? We tend to kind of go like, I felt proud of myself. And then we're like, okay, well, what made me feel proud of myself? Like, what did I do that was outside of my comfort zone? And how can I actually take that feeling? Because like even your whole face like changed. Like you just like started smiling ever so gently. You probably had some body sensation that felt really good and delicious. And we don't always take time to like be in those moments of like, what does bring me a sense of like joy and awe? Because there's like secrets there.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can tap into those more and more, then we can start to kind of feel even more aligned in our life.
Yeah. And so thank you for that exercise, by the way. It was great. And I feel like you kind of taught me in that moment too. So when you're talking about values with people, how would you kind of describe or decipher the difference between like traits or feelings, like kind of the ones I touched on, versus values and the difference between them?
So we have like traits of like how we describe ourselves, right? Like, so I'm 5'6", right? Like that kind of stuff. Values are kind of more like what's important to me and like what allows me to have a little bit of a compass in life. The difficulty is sometimes our values have been kind of infiltrated with what's out in the world, like the messages and the social expectations that we have. So then we have to actually learn about what we kind of just did there in that exercise is like what does joy feel like in my body? Like what does happiness feel like? What does awe feel like? And then the opposite, what does anger feel like? What does frustration? What does anxiety or stress feel like? Because that's going to allow us to know when we've kind of hit on a value or what's important. And I tell people that value becomes this kind of like really big overarching word, but it is about like internally what feels more aligned, and whether people find that kind of through interacting with humans where they feel like they can be authentic, whether they feel that kind of in a cultural perspective or a faith-based perspective, like all of those can kind of be really grounding, rooting, not characteristics, but I think like intentional kind of pieces that can like guide us. Mm-hmm. And if you ask people, they're all different, right? Like I once had a director go like, what you value most about yourself? And without hesitation, creativity came out of my mouth. And not all parts of my work are highly creative, right? Like sometimes it's very science-based and evidence-based. However, like that just like popped out. And so me even telling you that story, I bet there's one that like popped out in your mind too. And I think that's a good place to start. And so when I started cultivating recultivating my values during the pandemic, I kind of started there. Like, okay, what does creativity look like? How can I live a world where like creativity is at the forefront, and how diverse can I make that? And like, interestingly enough, like that's when I opened one of my Instagram accounts where like literally the tagline was like, I'm just a human being. I'm trying to like live my life creatively, period. And that's it. And so whatever I find beautiful, whatever I find interesting, whatever thoughts might come up that like fit into that form of creativity for me, like I'm going to share that. But like that's just one outlet. Mm-hmm. And then I said like, okay, what's joy into creativity? And then I landed on playfulness, and I was like, oh yeah, like I kind of desire to be playful and to experience that again and be curious. But like adult world is excellent at removing that. Mm-hmm. Right? Like play is not always part of our day. Then I'm like, okay, how can I insert play? Like, what does that look like? And like, sometimes that's just like moving my body ever so gently to a song, right? Like sometimes that's like singing out loud. Sometimes that's like doodling. Like, it's interesting how we don't give our ourselves like time just to like do nothing other than like what that looks like.
Yeah.
Or my oldest taught me to like gamify my life.
Okay.
I know, which is just like,
Tell me, what does this mean?
Oh my gosh, it is. So like, one thing, any kind of like paperwork is just really exhausting for me, right? Like, I could speak to people all day and like just enjoy their lovely company, but if I have to like write something out, I'm like, oh, that takes a lot of effort. And so I unplugged my computer and my battery. I know I have to get everything done within a certain amount of time. And so it's like this really interesting, and it works for me. It might not work for everybody, but you're like making it as much of a game as you can in that circumstance. And if we start to kind of think like that, then it's going to like lead us to a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah. Gamify. I love that.
It is. You can do it for all parts of your life.
Yeah. And I like that you touched on too, when to go back just a little bit, how you use the word recultivating. You were recultivating your values and things like that, and what they look like to you. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that they can sway, right? Like, obviously there are things that are near and dear to you and you do value, and that you do that do make up you as a person. But it's important, similar to all things in life, passions, boundaries, things like that, they're kind of yours to control. So as you grow and change, those values can kind of ebb and flow with you. And I think the recultivating aspect is a beautiful word to describe that. Because even during the pandemic, I feel like a lot of us did kind of a little bit more of that internal work. But I was working with a career coach too, and she was asking me, she's like, what do you value? And I feel like in that moment, it was one of the first times I actually stopped to think about it. And it was a lot of the standard words that you learn growing up, right? Family, health, things like that. And she's just like, okay, she's like, those are great, those are beautiful, but take them down a little bit deeper. And what does that look like to you? What about family? Like, what about your health? And so I think being able to maybe dive down into those and get to like the more juicy or the meatier parts, because like, yeah, I value health, but what is it? Like, do you value moving your body? Do you value regular checkups? Do you like things like that? And so getting into the nitty gritty.
Agreed. And it's, on, I think like joining that thought around like going like the next level down and like continuing that path. To me, it's also about finding your like wobble points of like, where would you want to have a stronger value, right? Like, what does that look like? And I think that's where that light place where like goals and intentionality kind of come in, where like for health, I'd love to live till I'm 125, right? So we're on that path. So yeah, movement comes in, healthy eating comes in, like all of those things. And then I'm like, okay, what's my wobble point? Like, my wobble point is like, I might not always be able to kind of move my body every day. So what does that look like? So in the like recultivation, it's like the identifying and also looking at your wobble points of, where do I maybe have to put a little bit more energy into it, but how can I also like compensate for that?
Yeah. And so when you're taking all that into consideration, how would you go into building sustainable goals with people?
I would have them change the word, for one. I do think language is somewhat important of how we like speak to ourselves. I would put it into intention and alignment, and how do we move towards that, and how do we move towards like a sense of expansion, because I think that's easier to clock overall, and it doesn't become as linear.
Okay.
And so when we kind of like move it away from goals, then we can have the conversation of like, what do you feel pressured to do? and like what actually feels like aligned and really just like fits, because people know when like things fit.
Mm-hmm.
Or they'll be like, oh, that doesn't fit. I'm like, that doesn't fit. Like, that's okay. And then we can kind of take out some of those like societal messages and then move towards like what authenticity like really looks like. And when people land on their authentic self, like, oh, it is a gorgeous moment, because like everything, they just have this direction and they're able to redirect if necessary. But this sense of like underlying joy exists, where even if they have a stumbling block or they have to pivot, it's almost like a neutral feeling. Like, of course I have to pivot. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so that whole thought pattern of like linear life has been removed.
Yeah. And I feel like too, to your point, the one of the coaches I'm working with right now likes to get into kind of like the masculine and feminine of things, and kind of finding that balance between. And I like that you are changing the word of goal settings, because even when I think about maybe career progression, you always have that, well, what's your 5-year goal or your 10-year goal? And even that question, thinking about it now, I'm like, I don't know. But if you're asking me like where I want to be in 5 years, that's going to depend on how I'm aligned and if I'm progressing the way that feels authentic and good to me, right? Like I don't know. For me, goal has always just been the word that's used. But when you think about intention and value and authenticity, you can't really put a time frame on that.
You can't. And then if you take the same question, but say like, what would you want to cultivate more in your life? Take out the 5 years, but right? It does produce like this really interesting response. You know, I had one friend be like highly successful, right? Like in his career path. And he said, he's like, finances for me or whatever I've gained from my career, like, one, I want to share it. 2, it's only meant to provide like more ease, and I'm going to make the money that like once I can't have that, then I'm like switching my game plan. Like, does he know what his game plan is? I don't know. Right. But I thought that was such an interesting way to say, like, I want to cultivate ease. This is the joining value in which I'm going to do it, because my joining value to ease is very different, right? I might want that same feeling and he might have that same feeling. But the way I go about it is not necessarily through like my career path, but maybe it's through creating really self-nurturing rituals like every night, right? Like being able to have like calm down, like that's going to set me in a place of ease. Or having like really beautiful connections with friends and like planning that out and giving space for that. That's my version of ease. And so even with like the same words, the same kind of like values, the same kind of intentions, people have very different ways to get there.
And I think that's such an important thing to remember too, right? Is that the fact that one person's definition or view of a word can be completely different from yours, and that's okay. Yeah, it's about finding that happy medium, or that place that you guys can both meet in the middle, depending on the topic, the issue, whatever it is, but that we're not all the same. And we're not all going to learn the same way, do things the same way, get to somewhere the same way, and recognizing that that's okay.
Yeah, it's a hard thing. I feel like we don't have, I think we're starting to have like more narratives like that and more like messaging around like we can be unique and like to the true sense of that word, right? Versus having to kind of follow a set plan. And I love that that's happening, right? Like when your coach kind of goes into like the masculine and feminine. I'm not sure if everybody knows that. they'll look it up maybe. Yeah.
Well, I like to quickly, like when we talk about it and when we reference it, for me, again, the way I was brought up and like societal's imprint on me for the longest time, and maybe up until the pandemic started, I was very much living in what was my masculine, which is like the do, the time frame, the get this done, the don't rest. Whereas she taught me to be able to be okay with moving a little bit more into my feminine and being okay with the lighter, the more ease, the not so kind of restrictive mindset. So again, it could be kind of any language that you want to choose here, but for the point that my coach and I we use that kind of masculine and feminine and kind of weaving them both together and instead of having one or the other, right? You can have the lighter side of things while still staying on track and getting your stuff done.
Yeah, it's so true. Like I think in rebranding and opening my private practice the way that I did, I made this like really clear commitment that I'm not wavering on. There we go. Is that I wanted it to happen by itself in the way that it was organically going to happen. That I wanted it to be creative. I wanted it to embody connection, and I wasn't willing to let that go. Like even the name, I had no idea what I was going to name like the business, right? And it was a friend who is my web designer. We went to the Spa Nordique, which is a fancy place to find a name, and we were just like, I'm like, I don't know. And he was like, well, I think this like could be your vibe. Like if we take what you like and like what you want to embody, like let's try to like think of some words. And I was like, I don't know. We were probably the only two there like writing on napkins of like what that looked like. Like everybody else I think was having like a romantic moment, and we were like, no. But we were in this space where we allowed for rest when both of us are like just we're like a go probably to a place where that's not healthy. And we were encouraging rest with one another and like connection. And it then like opened up this place of creativity. And then home came to be, right? And like from there, it was just this, like this beautiful process of like, I'm not going to set a timeline like this. I know maybe like the seedlings of what this private practice is going to be like, and part of it is helping individual people, but I also want it to grow so that I can support in the way that I can and what messages might resonate with other people on a larger scale, perhaps in a different scale. Like maybe that's like written material, like maybe it's like podcasts, whatever it happens to be. And I wasn't putting a framing on it. And that has been so freeing, because once I think I got that out of my mind of like, just let it grow, like just let it be, let it become its own like human, right? As you would like cultivate, and as like I've attempted to parent my children, like parent this, but like parenting isn't about always directing. It's allowing it to be, and like space to exist, and silences to exist, and like pace to go at whatever pace it wants to go at.
Yeah. And I think too, like you being such a creative human by nature, I think giving yourself that grace and that space for this to unfold in that organic way that you envisioned lends itself to your approach and the space and the business being what you kind of always wanted to be without that forced aspect.
100%. And like that word grace that you just used, how often do we not give it to one another or to ourselves?
Yeah.
Like to give that moment of like, that happened, right? Like whether like we feel like we did something or having interactions with other people. Grace, I think grace, ease, and rest, we don't give ourselves enough.
Oh, we don't.
Time or space to do that.
We don't. And I think we're slowly learning how to do it. But again, to the society that we live in, we're taught and we're bred and we're made to believe that you have to be on, you have to be going. And I think too, to the idea of connection and always being connected, people want that instantaneous response or whatever it is now. And even setting kind of those boundaries with work, like this is when I log off, I'll check in the next day. And I get that not all careers and jobs are the same. Sometimes you do have to be on depending on the nature of your career, but just the fact that there are people in our lives who are teaching us that no, it's okay to take rest and to slow down. And one of my good friends who we recently kind of rekindled our friendship. We were great best friends growing up, and then you age, you go separate directions, and we found our way back to each other now, and we're both in the same kind of field, if you would, health, wellness, yoga, connection, all that. And we were talking and we were like, well, what if it'd be fun to work on a project together? And I'm like, yeah, it would be. I mean, the coin term best friends, like we were best friends, we are best friends. And I remember showing up to her place, being like, we're just, this is the first time we've hung out in a space together that wasn't virtual in, I don't know, 5, 6, maybe 7 years. So that was a weird thing, but catching up on all things life, because we hadn't really had like heart to hearts in a while. It was more of those quick exchanges, but then also knowing that, okay, like we're getting together also too to see if we can work on a project together and what comes from that. And she is very much the creative being in our duo and loves to go with the flow and just see where things go. Whereas I'm like, okay, we have an hour of friend time, and then we're gonna move into this brainstorming session, and I'm getting better. But we spent the whole first night just catching up, and it was beautiful and it was great and it was so nurturing and like soul filling. And then the next day we got up, we went to a yoga class, and we came back, and she's like, okay, like let's set up the space. And so she made this beautiful like warm cocoon of blankets and pillows and chart paper and markers so we could just be in the creative. And I'm like, can I get my laptop? I'm like, I'll type up the notes. And she's like, no. She's like, we're going to sit here on the floor and just write whatever comes to mind. She made like one of those like mind chart things, and we just wrote words and what we wanted this retreat and this project to look like. And similar to how kind of you were coming up with the name for your business and whatnot, we were back and forth and saying what we wanted this to look like, and the colors and the theme and the feelings that we wanted people to get, and things like that. And maybe like 6 hours, we worked right into the night because we were just so in it. But we came up with a whole schedule for this project that we wanted to work on. We had, I say marketing, it's a very corporate term, but we had like the look, the feel, we had the name, and I was just like, wow, like that's what it feels like to be in your creative.
100%. And like that's what it feels like to be like both, I think, really connected in that space with someone and like aligned. I think often giving attention to what kind of gives us a spark or energy or whatever that looks like, people think that they're going like backwards, right? And really in that moment, you had friend time, you came together, and you actually probably got more done than if you were to like spread it out in this other way, right? And like the cultivation of that, like how beautiful is that experience? And probably, like I think my curiosity in like you sharing that story is like, how long did it feel like it was?
Oh yeah, no time at all.
And yet it could have been like 5 hours, right? And I think like that's such a beautiful like indication, I find, when there is a connection between you and another human, is if it feels like minutes, but it's been hours. And that's what it like, because people are like, am I connected? What does that look like? And like, does it feel like that?
Yeah,
like, does it feel...
absolutely. And yeah, in that moment, it felt like no time at all. And to your point of ease and just like allowing yourself to be, I think had I stayed on the course of like the more rigid, I'm going to be the note taker and whatnot, we wouldn't have gotten to where we were. And when I think about that story in that moment, even now in my day-to-day life, if I'm trying to get something done, and I'm always quick to grab the computer. I'm like, it's so ingrained in my head that it's like formal, and I'm like, it's just easier this way. And if I do pause and take that step back, and I'm like, well, what would it feel like if I just got my markers out and brain dumped or creatively did what I had to do on paper or whatnot, or in a journal before actually doing it? Have I given myself that space to then maybe clear out all those thoughts, or even get my thoughts organized to then do the task I had to do at hand?
Such an interesting point, right? Because like the computer or the phone, whatever people want to insert there, tends to become like a safety blanket, right? Or like a comfortable kind of like go-to of like, this is how I've always done it, so I probably should do it this way. And when you try something different, like you really do ignite like a totally different part of your like brain and your existence of like, what does that feel like to be an alternative space? Like, it's not better or worse, it's just different. And it's maybe an alternative to where to what you would have done right before. It's
breaking those kind of, I guess, like, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, maybe you know it, but like the ingrained thoughts of, for me, my instinct is to grab the computer, type it up, because I'm not creative, because I can't draw, or whatever it is there. Like for me, even till this day, like people are like, do you want to paint? I'm like, no, I can't paint. Like I suck at art. Like things like that. So it's like kind of breaking down those barriers of, well, no, like I can be, like I might not be Picasso, but I can be creative or artsy or whatever it is. It's not all or nothing.
It's not all or nothing. And we have been given like these very specific, I think, like messages from society, from academia, from the artistic world, whatever it happens to be. And at times, like we've lost what really, I think, like creatives in our world do so well, which is like curiosity, play, and just like flexibility of thought. Right? And so if you like take out all ways in which people are creative or are artists or whatever it happens to be, whether musician or painter or poet, the commonality is just like this authentic and deep curiosity about what they're doing, the willingness to go off script, the willingness to like come back or to play with an idea. And I think artists do that so well with actually like a fair amount of grace for themselves, where you see them like even in their dialogue, it'll be like, I played with this, or I thought about this, or I tried this out and it didn't really fit. And so maybe I'm going to keep it for another time and like go back to it. When you look at all of those folks, like being creative or living a creative life is about like inserting curiosity and playfulness and like just like wonderment in your life. And like we can do it in such easy ways that it's somewhat like baffling, but you have to keep doing it. Like that's the trick, is that you can do it once and you'll gain from it. But not now because it's winter months, but in the summer months, I like to choose my food like really, I don't even say wisely because it's not wise. It's just, I'll think about it for a long time. So I was like, ooh, that's a wobble point there. We should be living like a fuller life. So now I'll go to like an ice cream shop and be like, what am I curious about? And like, as soon as you ask yourself, like, where do I desire to go immediately? And it's to the flavor that I had the week previous because I know what it tastes like. And in that moment, like it's not anything mind-blowing. It's not going to change my life. But in that moment, it's a practice of like, no, could you be curious about something else? And maybe it not be perfect and maybe it not be as satisfying because you do know what it feels like. Sure, you'll get that the next week. It's fine. Go with your joy. But I think even in those moments, it's like, no, can we go outside of the box? And you can literally do that every day. You can like take a different route to work. You can, my friends probably think it's weird, but I'll like write little like messages to them of like, good morning. That's like a change in my morning. right? My morning could go like really linear, right? Like coffee, work, go. And so if someone could get into that mind frame of like curiosity, creativity, and playfulness, and like you insert a little bit of joy in there, and that you're like going aligned with that, the beauty that comes from it. Like if you just do that for a week, like the insights that you'll gain around yourself. Yeah.
I think too, to that point, you, like you said, like it's a practice, right? You can do it once, maybe notice the change, but the more you do it, the more it becomes maybe natural or a little bit more second nature. And I think too, we're so hard on ourselves and resistant of wanting that change, right? We're, to your point of, I could text my friends good morning and it's something different in my morning. But for so many of us, it's get up, do the thing, have the coffee, make the breakfast, drive to work, where it's like, well, what if you pushed your coffee and had your coffee at work? Like little changes like that.
All of it, right? Like it is around kind of like the what if, because we do what if in a really fearful way. Like, what if this happens? What if this, and really holds us back from doing much of anything, right? But you can also use that, like, what if I had a really enjoyable moment right now? Like, I wonder, what if I moved into connection versus routine, right? And I think that my children have been like just such a valuable cultivator of like my own authenticity and challenging a lot of different pieces, because what you have to give as a parent, I think is very different, right? That like children literally grow on like love and food and shelter, but like love is like a major one, and connection. And so in the morning, my youngest is just such a gentle reminder of like starting my day with connection, that the temptation is for me to like grab my lunch and like go and be out. And every morning we like go like head to head, and I don't move until they move away, because then I know that they've been nurtured enough. And like that's the language that we've cultivated. But it takes 1 minute, not even. And yet it is so satisfying to start your day in a different way and to start it with connection of any type, that it does like blow my mind.
Yeah. Oh, and that's what a beautiful way to start your morning, period. But also to be teaching your child that like that's okay, in a way that like connection is something that we need to be able to grow as humans, and you're giving them your full attention in that moment. You're giving them the space to feel what it is they need. You're giving them the space to get what they need, and then hopefully carry that into their day in the world with them.
I also like learned from them the difference in way people feel connection, because I think that I've kind of had to learn the boundaries in which they feel it the most, right? So like the oldest one isn't necessarily like a hugger, but like does like when he downloads his brain, like just be present. So like that's his form of connection, where I'm like, okay, now I have to like be here, and whatever that might be. But I think it is also another gentle reminder of we all connect in different ways, and it's like reading and asking and being curious, because I think sometimes we don't do that. I think we're not like, how do you feel connection, Lauren? Like, what does that make you feel inside? Like, when was a moment where you really felt like disconnected or unheard? Or what do you like need sometimes that like maybe you don't want to share with people because you think you won't be able to get it? Right? Like we sometimes like stop having conversations like that, even though they can like bring us closer, especially to people who are like quote unquote like safe people, right? Like people we already have like a little bit of a relationship with. But I think your example of like friends reconnecting, that's like such a beautiful moment to be like, we're new people. Excellent. Like, let me meet you again.
Yeah.
You know, like what does your life look like now? I sometimes ask the question, because I don't like the question of how are you doing? because my default is good.
Yeah, fine.
Right?
Mm.
Good.
Yeah.
And I don't do this to everybody because it gets weird for people, but like, how is your heart today? And that brings like really interesting responses. And again, you can't ask that to everybody, but like the ones that you can, like that is a moment.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a moment of connection. And so when you think about connection, like the connections in your world, because we just spent quite a few minutes talking about what that looks like and how we can go about fostering it and doing it. I guess this could be both in your career, given that you are a connector, but also in your personal life. How do you go about not only building connections, because I feel like you've talked about that a bit, but how do you go about kind of maintaining and nurturing those existing connections that you have?
There's two things. One, I do see all connections being kind of like of value. And during, like, again, the pandemic, I know it was a long time ago, but like really taught me some valuable lessons of like micro moments and micro connections of like, I would say like people that you pass and you smile on the street, right? Like those ones, like you don't have to cultivate anything. Like you don't have to put really much into them. They can be really satisfying. If you have like seven of those in a day, like your body and your mind is like going to get something from it, right? To your question of like, how do I cultivate and sustain? It's always a hard one, right? Because it's as you grow, that person also grows. I think, again, like some of my clients might hate this word after a while, but like that curiosity factor, that willingness to be like accountable, I think is really important. And to, I think, explain actions, or even to like learn how someone likes to be loved, because sometimes people need, like after a busy week, they need some like decompression time. Other people like need connection, like whether it's like this, some people need like physical connection, whatever it happens to be. I think learning and being curious in that respect of like, how does someone feel secure and seen? As soon as you know like the answers to those, I think it could be like just such a magical moment in like a friendship or connection.
Yeah. And when you think about like what you just described and being curious and mentioning kind of how sometimes as you grow, people are growing too, and you're kind of relearning and rediscovering them as, I guess, the seasons of their life evolve. I'm curious to know what your take is on how, if someone has, say, a different idea of connection, or I'm going to go with the love languages here because that's just where my brain is at, and how some people like touch, and some people like words of affirmation, and some people like gift giving. So say your love language was touch, like you love hugs, you love like gentle moments, like a tap on the shoulder, but like mine was words of affirmation. How would you go about navigating the fact that you like, yeah, if I'm not a hugger, how do you like honor you, I guess, respect and honor your values and boundaries and limits, but also kind of reciprocating to the other person?
That's a tricky question. I do think it comes with dialogue. Number one, do you like the when we talk about love language, I guess it's more like intimately linked to romantic relationships, right? So let's like ground it there. I think understanding what other people can give and what that looks like is like a starting place. So if like words of affirmation, sometimes it's actually as hard to do for a lot of people, because like they're also unsure of like, what does affirmation look like for you? Is it like a good job? Or is it like, I really noticed you like made this effort and wow, Like, I'm so proud of you for like risking and like going for it. Or like, what's the level of affirmation do people need? And I think that goes with like, what level of physical touch does that need? And then like meeting in the middle of like what feels the most comfortable. And I think in the healthiest of relationships, this is where we would want to go, is like, can we evolve and can we continue to do things that might make us feel not unsafe or hurt or anything like that, but in that zone of growth, right? Which doesn't always feel comfortable, but when people are like committed to, I think, growing with one another, then they're also kind of committed to saying like, okay, can we continue to have a conversation of like, I might need to be spoken to like this. How does that feel? And somebody might be like, I've never used those words ever in my life, but like, teach me. Maybe like, how do you want to be spoken to, or what does like an authentic hug feel like? So I think, again, like just being open with one another versus like assumptions, I think is really important. And like looking at people's like levels, right? Sometimes I put it into like like whether somebody's kind of more of like a glacier, like, is that a slower pace for them? Do they need to go at a slower pace? That's going to allow, because if the goal is ultimately authentic, beautiful, rooted connection, then that also requires somebody to read somebody else. And like, are they more of like a glacier, but like a slow opener, right? Like, do you just need like to give them space to be able to like contemplate things? Like, they're not going to be the people who give you a response right away. Are there people like sailboats? Like, you give them like this moment where like it connects to them and they're just like, you're off, right? You're like now friends. Or something like a speedboat where you're just like, you're connecting with that person and you're like, yes. And 4 hours feels like 2 minutes. Right? And so if we like look at it in different ways, like sometimes we have to say like, what is our goal? Is our goal to connect in the way that I only know how to connect? Or is the goal to connect in a deep, meaningful way? And that usually requires 2 or more people. So
yeah,
it's like a read the room kind of situation.
Yeah, read the room. And I like that you mentioned too, it's kind of communication, right? It comes down to not only communication styles, but communicating, I guess, your needs in that moment or in that instance. Whereas some people don't do that, and you're kind of expected to maybe read their mind or know what they're feeling in that moment. So I like the analogies of the glacier and the sailboat and the speedboat, because it's true. We meet people at so many different stages in our lives who are also at different stages, and kind of that ebb and flow and that back and forth of finding that happy medium for you both, where you're both feeling safe and secure, and then allowing the relationship to grow.
Yeah, and it's a hard one, right? Because like people are coming with like all of the messages that they've received, whether they're like a linear thinker, whether they're more abstract, right? There's all of these conversations, and I kind of call it that there are also like some people who I can do like shorthand with, where I don't even have to express all of my thoughts, and they like kind of get where I'm going.
Yeah.
Right? They already know, they already know, like, know the end, but they're like, okay, you don't have to give me all the details because I see that like you want to talk about like this point, or like this was really like passionate for you or curious. And then there are other people who like you do need to give a little bit more, and that you can't quite do the shorthand right away.
Yeah.
So I think there's all these like little nuancing points to like what connection is.
Yeah.
And then it's people figuring out, you know, like what types of connections they want. Because I think that's the other thing.
Yeah.
Is that like, I'm not going to age myself, but like right now it's like authenticity, right?
Yeah.
I will welcome your authenticity, right? Like, please welcome mine, I would want. And if that's not aligning, it doesn't mean that, you know, like another season, as you said, like won't come around. It does mean like in that moment, like aligning just doesn't fit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like too, as we get older, we kind of value that more secure, authentic relationships, and don't necessarily always have time for all the drama that some relationships can bring with it. And as you grow and you build those relationships too. I like that you mentioned being able to read people and getting to know them on that deep level. There's someone in my life who, when you said that, I was like, oh, yep. She like I know her so well, and she's a beautiful human being, but when we're talking, or when there's, say, like a decision coming up or something like that, it's funny because if she asks the same question like 5 or 6 times but words it differently each time, if I clue in, which usually I do, I'm like, oh, that's their way of just telling me to make the decision. Like, they don't want to make it.
Right.
So I'm like, oh, okay, we're going here for dinner. Like, it's like, they're not like major life decisions. Sometimes they are, but for the most part, not major life decisions. They can't do it. It's overwhelming. It's physically, like, they're just like, they don't know. So by the time like that question rolls around for the 5th time, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm on it. Yep, we're going here. But yeah.
I love that.
Okay, so we're almost out of time today, but I want to ask you one more question, because I feel like this lines up with your career, but also raising children and things like that. And I'm very curious to get your take on connection and technology. And
I have so much to say on that topic.
Yeah, I want to know how it plays into your world, again, both as a parent and in your career, and if you feel like there's maybe a hindrance, but also maybe a pro.
One pro, because you asked at the beginning around like, how do people know their values? Okay, so technology, we can actually harness this a little bit. So you don't have to put anything like super personal into AI, but if you take small moments throughout your week, just like how you did like surfing, right? But you put them in and say, over the past week, I've done this and this and this and this that's brought me joy. And then ask AI, whatever your source is, right? Please guess what my top 5 values are. That is so enlightening, because it allows you to rule in or rule out. Because then it's going to be like, oh, okay, that one really fits, because you're going to know like when you look at the 5.
Yeah.
And then the next week, try to live by one of those.
Okay.
So AI, technology, connection.
That.
Yes.
I've heard of, I haven't tried it yet, but I've wanted to, using AI. Someone said, get AI like to write, what is it? Your envisioned day or whatever.
Oh, your perfect day.
Yeah, your perfect day. And another thing I haven't tried, but I was like, oh my gosh, like that would be so cool to see, because oftentimes in therapy or wherever, you're like, journal what a perfect day would look like to you. And I've done that many times.
Yeah.
And for the most part, like, strangely enough, my perfect day has stayed relatively the same over the right. evolution of my life. But I would be so curious as to...
Well, and I would be so curious for you to put in that perfect day and say, like, what could make it more perfect? Right? Like, I think that when I've only like started to slowly introduce like AI into my practice, but around this, when people get like really blocked or stuck, where they're like, I have too many messages being like sent my way by society, and I'm not sure like how to ground it in me. And I'm like, just put in like not identifiable information, just like random things. Like, I had a great ice cream. I talked to like somebody at the coffee shop, and they told me like this, right? Like, we don't have to do anything personal or big. And then ask, like, what are my values? What does that look like? That can really like start to seed so many things, and really like bring that like creative side, and like really spark some of those pieces. So that would be the one: technology, connection and technology. So like knowing oneself. Love-hate relationship with technology, right? I think that at times it's really easy to use like texting to feel like we're being connected, but I do think that it's a lesser form of connection. That might be like unpopular opinion. I think that it's easier to have arguments on it. I think that it's easier to say things that like aren't necessarily authentic, but might be like niceties. I think that it is more difficult for people to read the situation right? And if other places, like if you haven't met in person a lot of the time, it's hard to kind of cultivate and to understand somebody's shorthand or to understand how somebody might say something, right? At the same time, having conversations with teenagers, like memes seem to be our love language. They're hilarious. So I think that there's also kind of like pieces like that. But I'm always like pro like human to human connection, right? Like even if it's messy and even if it's weird and even if there's a temptation to like put up a wall, like 100% better.
Yeah.
Because like that's the human experience.
Oh, absolutely. And I would agree with that. I mean, texting and messaging and whatnot is great for those check-ins and those moments of showing people that you're there, and memes too. Like I love sending people memes because we touched on it a few episodes ago where it's just like it's great to know that, hey, that person thought of me and sent me this. But yeah, when I want to get into it or when I want to have a conversation with you, whether conflict or not, or I'm just having a day or I want to check in on how you're doing, like I don't know, there's something about a phone call or a coffee or a drink in someone's living room that gives you that emotional rapport with them that sometimes messaging doesn't do. Because I also feel like too, emotions can fly high when you're texting or messaging, and oftentimes your tone might not come across the way that you wanted to come across. Your message is interpreted the way they want to see it. Whatever's going on in their mind and they're reading that, like it gets jumbled and it gets messy. And
it does. And my preferred way that no one else except for 3 friends of mine like are voice notes. Yeah, no one likes that. But like the people who love them.
Yes.
And I will listen to it all day. I will start my day and sometimes I know that there's like 6. I'm like, great. This is gonna get me all right around the block. And you press play and then like you're just hearing about someone's life that is not always someone's ideal. Like to me, texting is a little bit kind of like lower on the list, and I don't think it always has been, but I think like more recently as like my value of like human to human connection has grown, like that's so vital. And even like sharing like photos, again, like that's another level of connection, or like video, another level of connection, you know, phone, which I think people also get terrified with, right? Like another level of connection. And so like there's all of these other pieces that we could do. And if it's a collection of those, I think that then that, sure, like that's a different way of which we're connecting, right? Before maybe it was the phone, now we're sending a text, but we also know that we're going to be seeing that person, or we're planning to see them, or we're talking in different ways. And I think that diversity is really impactful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I feel like there's so many, you just said it, but if you're using all of those communication styles or ways, it builds the relationship up that much more than just using one or whatnot.
And I think that that's how, maybe I'm just like putting out a wild assumption. I do think that people are getting to that place now too, where texting will be seen as like non-investment, or like lower investment. And then it's like determining whether that's something you want. Right? Like there are some people who are very far away, and I know that us connecting like via phone or something is probably not going to work, but us exchanging messages every day when our hours align, but that's like a continued conversation, that's going to work in that way, right? Someone else kind of being in the city, and I'm like, okay, well, we have an opportunity to connect, right? Like, and to nurture that friendship or whatever it happens to be. Then I think then it becomes like a different situation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Like I once had a friend who we're friends to this day. And now I'm lucky enough to have her in the city. But for 10 years of our friendship, so university into our like mid-20s, she was always working somewhere else, and she would send me postcards. So we literally had a friendship built on postcards.
Oh my gosh.
And when she would come back into town, we would just like pick up where we left off. But if you were to look, like, no phone calls, like there was definitely like no texting capability. So the occasional email maybe, but really it was postcards. And so like as she would move around to like different countries, she'd be like, saw this and thought of you, or whatever it happens to be. And like I have some of them to this day.
Oh my gosh.
And so I think that's, I can maybe say like a blanket statement about like hierarchy of like technology, and at the same time that exists.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe then, like as I'm talking to you, like maybe then the assessment is around like the growth of that connection, but also like whether it resonates with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh. I feel like I could talk to you all day. I just want to keep picking your brain. There's that curiosity. But we are going to just quickly move into a couple of rapid fire because I feel like they're always fun. And I'm going to throw to you and ask you what the last movie or TV show was that you watched.
Osmosis.
Okay, I don't know it.
Yeah, so it's a sci-fi one. It's in French, but you can subtitle it.
Do you speak French?
Not a lot of French. I can understand French.
Okay.
Yes. So that would be
Osmosis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Last book you read and or podcast you listened to?
Let's go for a podcast. I've been kind of really into Diary of a CEO.
Okay.
I was another friend like recommended, and started I think like really more as like a businessy oriented podcast, but now like it's like on all the topics. So I've been listening to that at the gym. So yeah.
I have another friend who's been listening to that almost religiously and loves it. So favorite food?
Oh my gosh, as we talked about my food indecision issues. That's a hard one. Okay. This was just most recent, but I do love a good artisan caramel. Yes.
Okay.
I know that's a weird one, but just a little sweet treat. I think it like meets like everything.
Just hits that.
It's not a food, but like if I were to think about like
a snack
after a meal, like that's something like just love.
Okay. Who or what inspires you?
Do you know, I think that we'll go with the Who on that one. And somebody who's really inspired me was my grandfather. So he was blind, and everyone would say like, you all like get along really well together. But I think it was because like he allowed me to be in that creative space of like not using your eyes, like not having to like see the world in a very particular way in which it was constructed. Mm-hmm. And so that whole like playful part of myself was able to like really exist. Yeah. And that intuition, right? Like I would see him walk around like the world like without sight, and like the intuitive part of him was just like so clear. And the way that you have to connect with other people when you're really not making eye contact, or all of these kind of other pieces, was just like really inspiring. And like from like a child's eyes perspective, like you're just like soaking in all this information of how like other people create connection and see the world, and like how they're creating like this architecture of the world in their mind, and like just
what a beautiful way to not only grow up, but to kind of not already have those predetermined biases, and just to be able to witness that. Oh wow. If you could give yourself one piece of advice, or your younger self one piece of advice.
Oh, I know what it is.
Okay.
It is the fact that perfection is a myth, and we should all just work for like refinement and alignment.
Refinement and alignment.
I'm telling you, like perfectionism, it's
not a thing.
It's not a thing. Like it is a thing, in that like people experience it, and then we tend to lean into it, and it's like all part of like the hustle culture and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, it does nothing for the soul. But refinement.
Yeah.
It's a sweet place.
Beauty. And then finally, last one. We have the Simply Connected playlist that we like to add songs to.
I saw that question.
It's one of my favorites because I always, as like a music lover, I always like start to listen to new artists. And it was actually Sophia who was on, who I think she mentioned Camp. CAAMP, I think, maybe. I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, never heard of them before, and she was talking about them, and I was just like, okay, let's try it, and obsessed. So if you could add a song to the Simply Connected playlist, what would you want to add?
I feel like this I don't know if I could add just one song, but how about I give you the artist?
Yes.
And then I'll maybe like think about the song.
Okay.
Milk and Bone, Canadian, amazing live, so talented. If I remember the album correctly, it would be Deception Bay is one of my favorite ones, but like they're all great. I love it deep winter, like cozy music, and I also love it like hot summer. Like in Ottawa, you know, like that hottest day that we ever have.
Yeah.
It runs true on both.
Both
seasons.
Okay.
Yeah. But like they have a strong place in my heart.
Okay.
Yeah.
We will add them to the playlist. I love this. All right. Well, we have ran out of time today.
This has been so lovely.
It was an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you. And
likewise.
we'll talk soon.
Perfect. All right. Bye.